Okay. I've said for some years now that history and genealogy are two of the socially acceptable forms of gossip. You can quote me on that just as long as you footnote me. Joyce always used to. Think about it. Have you ever noticed how many of us have questions with answers that are considered gossip and nosiness if the people involved are still alive? But wait a generation or two, and the very same information becomes history or genealogy. To quote the old TV commercial for the National Enquirer, of which it was once said that if there was any truth in it, it sneaked in by accident. Inquiring minds want to know. On his first solo album after leaving the Eagles, Don Henley even co-wrote and recorded a song about just how gossipy people are. You might remember it. It's called Dirty Laundry. Anyway, moving away from Dirty Laundry, all the way back to the summer of 1967, which I remember chiefly because I had to have my tonsils and adenoids out, right after the school year ended. A lot of the conversations around the proverbial water cooler or at the proverbial water fountain were about this one particular song. It was written and sung by a young woman who was originally from rural Mississippi, whose name was Bobbie Gentry, and the song, you might remember, is Ode to Billie Joe.
Was the 3rd of June, another sleepy, dusty Delta day. I was out chopping cotton and my brother was baling hay. And at dinner time we stopped and went back to the house to eat. And Mama hollered at the back door, y'all remember to wipe your feet. And then she said, I got some news this morning from Choctaw Ridge. Today, Billie Joe McAllister jumped off the Tallahatchie Bridge. Papa said to Mama as he passed around the black-eyed peas, well, Billie Joe never had a lick of sense. Pass the biscuits, please. There's 5 more acres in the lower 40 I got to plow. And Mama said it was a shame about Billie Joe anyhow. Seems like nothing ever comes to no good up on Choctaw Ridge. And now Billie Joe McAllister's jumped off the Tallahatchie Bridge. Brother said he recollected when he and Tom and Billie Joe put a frog down my back at the Carroll County Picture Show. And wasn't I talking to him after church last Sunday night? I'll have another piece of apple pie. You know it don't seem right. I saw him at the sawmill yesterday on Choctaw Ridge. And now you tell me Billie Joe's jumped off the Tallahatchie Bridge. Mama said to me, child, what's happened to your appetite? Well, I've been cooking all morning and you haven't touched a single bite. That nice young preacher, Brother Taylor, dropped by today. Said he'd be pleased to have dinner on Sunday. Oh, by the way, he said he saw a girl that looked a lot like you up on Choctaw Ridge. she and Billie Joe was throwing something off the Tallahatchie Bridge. A year's come and gone since we heard the news about Billie Joe. Brother married Becky Thompson, they bought a store in Tupelo. There was a virus going round, Papa caught it and he died last spring. And now Mama doesn't seem to want to do much of anything. And me, I spend a lot of time picking flowers up on Choctaw Ridge and drop them into the muddy water off the Tallahatchie Bridge.
Okay, so the family gathers in the middle of the day for their dinner. Remember, this was out in the country, so dinner was the midday meal around noon, which was followed by a supper in the evening. And the mother tells them the news about Billie Joe. Who told her? Probably that nice young preacher, Brother Taylor. Because the mother specifically says that he dropped by that day, in other words, that morning. There's also a very good chance that the preacher's mention of having seen Billie Joe and a girl who looks a lot like the narrator throwing something off the bridge tells us why he decided to visit that particular family on that particular morning, to see if anybody in the family knew anything about Billie Joe's death. It could be very important if one of them were keeping some secret which could blow his congregation apart if it got out. Now, the father's reaction to the mother's news is swift and pretty much dismissive. Well, Billie Joe never had a lick of sense. Pass the biscuits, please. So, who says things like that? I mean, that's all you get from him before he tries to change the subject very pointedly by going on to how many acres he has to plow. No speaking well of the dead, nary a word of sympathy for the young man's obvious pain, let alone the void that's just been ripped from the center of whatever family he left behind. Now, you initially hoped for more from the mother. At least she has the good grace to say that it's a shame about Billie Joe anyhow. The mother also notices her daughter's complete loss of appetite, but she apparently doesn't connect the dots and work out that her daughter's loss of appetite might be the opening stage of a grief response. The girl's beginning to shut down because of the sudden loss of Billie Joe. In fact, the daughter seems to be the one member of this family really affected by the death. And the mother's failure to comprehend what her daughter is going through is especially ironic, since she herself will shut down as a grief response after her husband's death from an unidentified viral infection. And that's over the course of the next year. Likewise, the brother mentions several of his memories of Billie Joe, two of which even involve his sister. One of them on the previous Sunday night, which might well have been when the preacher saw Billie Joe and the daughter together on the bridge. But beyond that, the brother seems as oblivious as his parents to the idea that the reason his sister has completely lost her appetite after a morning of hard physical labor spent out in the fields chopping cotton, weeding it with a hoe to get, with a sharpened hoe, and sometimes rows of cotton were like a half a mile long, is because of the girl's grief over Billie Joe's death, or at least her shock. Now, this is where the gossipy side of human nature comes back in. Although Bobbie Gentry herself has said that the song is fictional, and a study in what she calls unconscious cruelty, listeners have mainly fixated on two things: and I'll bet you can name what they are. One of them is, what was thrown off that bridge? The other is, what drove Billie Joe to his last desperate act? And some of the theories people have come up with about these things are actually pretty lurid. One story says that the girl had had an illegal abortion and that she and Billie Joe had thrown the unborn fetus off the bridge. Another story is that Billie Joe was experiencing intense guilt stemming from a drunken same-sex encounter, and that was what drove him to end his life. Gentry herself is on record as saying that all of this speculation is beside the point that she was trying to make. And that point is that these people were so wrapped up in their own lives that it prevented them from reaching out when a member of their own family was in observable and intense pain. And in the last verse, we find that the daughter apparently treats her mother the same way when the father dies. Instead of reaching out to her mother and either consoling her or bonding with her over their shared loss, the father, the younger woman spends most of her time going up to Choctaw Ridge, picking flowers and dropping them off the bridge into the muddy water. But if you have to have a backstory for this song, it's just as likely something simple. How many of you remember Occam's razor? Yeah, the simplest explanation is usually the best. So say the daughter found out that her father was unlikely to let her marry Billie Joe. What's the man's opinion of Billie Joe again? He never had a lick of sense. I myself had a great uncle who, according to family tradition, ended his life because his father, my great-grandfather, said that the boy was too young at age 17 to get married. And that was back in 1938, when a number of people, especially out in the country, did get married at younger ages than are common now. You remember Romeo and Juliet. She was not quite 14, and he was around 17. And instead of being a great love story, it was a weekend fling that ended up with 6 people dead at the end of it. 3 by violence, 2 by their own hand, and 1 from a broken heart. And yes, you can die from a broken heart. Yet what might be a real backstory for the song, or at least part of the inspiration for it, happened a dozen years before the song came out. In August of 1955, does anybody recognize that date? Okay. About the time that a young Bobbie Lee Streeter, as she was known then, Bobbie Gentry was her stage name, moved from rural Mississippi, where she'd been living with either her father's parents or her father for a few years, out to Palm Springs, California, to be with her mother, who had gotten remarried. A 14-year-old black boy from Chicago was visiting relatives in the tiny town of Money, Mississippi. His name was Emmett Till. Emmett was accused of acting improperly toward a young white woman who was working alone in the grocery store that she and her husband, who was out of town at the time of the alleged incident, owned and operated. When the husband returned and heard the allegations, he was furious. The prosecutor said later that he had excluded all the people who knew the defendants from being on the jury, and thought in retrospect that that might have been a mistake because the man was not well liked. The husband wasn't that well liked. But anyway, the husband returned and heard the allegations. He was furious. And he and his half-brother went round after dark to the house where Emmett was staying with his great uncle and kidnapped the boy. Then they lynched him, shooting him twice in the head and finally throwing his lifeless body into the Tallahatchie River, possibly from the same bridge that Bobbie Gentry references in the song. One end of that bridge was quite close to the store where the incident with the white woman allegedly took place. They found Emmett's body 3 days later, and his mother back in Chicago insisted on having an open casket funeral so that the world could see what hate did to her boy. Joyce used to talk about, the occasions when the battleship Mama sailed into the harbor with all of the guns out and leveled, when somebody was, or some situation was threatening one of her children. It sounds very much like the same thing. The two men who lynched Emmett were put on trial, but acquitted by an all-white, all-male jury. Yet the resulting publicity sparked outrage and is considered one of the catalysts for the civil rights movement. Equality and social justice are vital to the Christian life as we Quakers see it, and have tried to live it for the past 375 years or so. We try to live in the virtue of that which takes away the occasion of all wars. We also remember Jesus' words in the parable of the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25:40. Truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these, you did it to me. This last is important because it has informed Quaker ethics for several centuries now, nor are we the only ones by any means. But stop and think about it for a minute. When we feed the hungry, we're feeding Jesus. When we provide shelter, clothing, or just a listening ear, we're doing it to Jesus as well as for Jesus. When we actually take the time to listen to each other instead of just trying to think of the next thing we're going to say, God is in that small act of presence and connection. That's what's missing with the family we encounter in Ode to Billie Joe. They don't really listen to each other, and they certainly don't really look to see how each other might be doing, so they talk at each other, not to each other. As for the possible connection of the Bobbie Gentry song with what happened to poor Emmett Till, just remember what we read in 1 John. Those who claim to love God but hate others are liars. How can you love God whom you haven't seen if you hate the people whom you have seen? Or in the words of something I've seen online, you can't worship God and treat other people like garbage. When I was growing up, we learned a song which pretty much sums things up and which seems like it might be a fitting place to end, or at least to become quiet so we can all reflect a bit more. It was written by a Catholic nun after the range of music acceptable for the Mass was broadened after Vatican II. And somebody added some more verses to it. Anyway, this is how it ended up. Love one another, love one another, as I have loved you, and care for each other, care for each other, as I have cared for you. And and bear one another's burdens, and share each other's joys, and love one another, and bring each other home. Forgive each other here as I've forgiven you. Be friend to each one here as I've been friend to you. Pray together here as I have prayed with you. Serve each other here as I have served you. Sing together here as I have sung with you. Enjoy each other here as I've rejoiced with you. And love one another as I have loved you. And care for each other as I have cared for you. And bear one another's burdens, and share each other's joys, and love one another, and bring each other